continue. So recording is in progress. So I forgot to switch off the waiting room. So in the meantime, I'm admitting people. So welcome to the final lecture of Business Technology and Innovation. So lecture number 14. And I want to do a couple of things in this lecture. First of all, there's one more topic I'd like to discuss, which is about implementation strategies that will take us about, I think, half an hour or so to discuss. I want to show you an example of a correct solution for the database assignment, and I want to give you some information about the exam, what you can expect next week on the exam. So I think I'll start with the database assignment, then the implementation part, and then the exam. So if you have questions on the exam, about the exam, please wait until we actually start discussing the exam, or you can already post them in the chat and I'll answer them when we start with the exam information. So, okay, so first of all, let me switch to the correct screen. Here it is. I now post the model answers to the database assignments online, so you can find them in modules for the last lecture. You can find these. You can find this document to see what a correct solution would be to the database assignment. There are a few things I want to show you. The first thing is this one, and I think most people did this correctly in the database assignments, is that if you want to connect two tables to each other that have a many-to-many relationship, so a customer can order and watch more than one program, and a program can be watched by more than one customer. Which is a similar situation as students and courses, for example. You as students follow more than one course, and a course is followed by more than one student. So it's a many-to-many relationship. And in order to solve that in a database design, you need a connecting table between the two tables. So most of it is correct, and you can call the table whatever you like. Here I call it ordered, but some of you have called it purchases or whatever. Purchases is arguably a better name. An important thing is that that in that connecting table you have both the customer ID and the program ID, and I here also included a date time ordered, so you know when a customer has ordered which program, so at what point in time. And this way, if you would look at this table in Excel or like what filled in data, the orders table would, for example, contain customer number 1 has watched program number 1, customer number 1 has also watched program number 2, customer number 2 has also watched program number 2, well, etc. And that way you can connect these two tables to each other. As you see here, I've included a rating in the ordered table as well as paid fee, because a customer gives a rating for a specific program. So I give program 1 an 8 and someone else would give it a 5. The rating for a specific program by a specific customer should go in the connecting table. Similar to paid fee, because a fee may change over time, so you need to know how much a customer actually paid for a specific program. So paid fee also needs to be included in the order table. So if you update a program's fee, you update it here in the programs table, and then if a new customer is ordering that program, he gets billed the correct fee, and it's included as paid fee here. So that was the most important part of the crow's feet mean many. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So it's from 1 to many. So the crow's feet is a many, the many part. Well, the solutions are here, including the SQL programming, SQL code that you would need to get get information out of the database. Then in the second part of the assignment, there were a couple of additional questions. So the first request of the organization was, we want to have customer information from the CRM system into the customers table of the VOD system. And this was a bit of a trick question, because this is actually a very bad request, because this makes data redundant, because they ask, okay, we have customer information in a specific information system. We want you to copy and paste that information into another system, which is actually a very bad thing to do, because if a customer, for example, changes address or some other customer information changes, you need to change it in 2 different locations. And that's not what we want in a database. So actually, your request that they made here is a bad request. And if you would be an advisor to the organization, you would then advise, well, I would not do that. I would include a link between the customer relationship management system and the customer table in the VOD system. So, for example, by including customer ID also in the CRM system, or the other way around. That would be the best solution. Of course, this was a bit of a trick question, so you didn't get an incomplete if you did what they asked. Actually, in this most simple solution that I give here, I just did what the customer asked and included this in the customer table. What else? Yeah, so they also include genre information, information about additional information about the program, information about the supplier, and a past position. Should also be functionalities included in the system, so they should also be included in the database. Well, the most simple solution is this. The past position needs to be in the order table, because of course a specific customer pauses a specific program at a specific time. So this needs to be included here. And all the information about the program can be included in the program. So program name, program fee, program file name, etc. What many of you did was extended this solution even further. For example, with program genre, this actually is also a many-to-many relationship, because a program can have more than one genre. It can be an action and comedy program. So it's actually a many-to-many relationship, and many of you also did this correctly. So you created a subtable with the genre information. Yeah, question here, does it make sense to create a different table for past positions since it feels weird to include it in the order table? Yeah, good point. I would say that the order table is a table which contains information only about the specific customers programs ordered, and things like past positions is more like a technical aspect of the system. So I would say this probably, if you would design this, would be stored somewhere else and would not be stored in that table, but would probably be a separate, maybe even a separate system, a separate technical system that handles this. So yeah, you're right. So probably it would be included in a different table. But in the most simple solution, it can also be included in the order table because it relates to both customer and program. The final thing I want to say is that in some solutions I saw that sometimes fields were added to tables that were not strictly necessary. So for example, average rating or average fee, or the number of programs watched by a customer. So in general, things that you can calculate from a table, you do not have to include as a field. So for example, if I want to calculate the average rating for a program, I simply, so for example, the program number is 1, then I simply ask the database to give me all the ratings for program number 1, and then take the average of this, and then the database system will give me the average back, because the system can calculate that from the information it already has. Similarly, if I want to know how many programs a customer watched in the past month, I can simply ask the database system, because we have customer ID, we have program ID, we have daytime ordered. You can simply ask the system, okay, give me the count or the number of programs that a customer has ordered, that, for example, the customer number 1 has ordered in the past month. So you can also calculate that. Well, and other examples as well. You can also calculate the fee that you should bill a customer each month. You can calculate how much a program has brought in, the amount of money a program has delivered to you as a company in the past month, etc. Those are all things you can calculate from this data alone. So you can see that even with only 3 tables here, with a relatively small amount of data in it, you can already calculate lots and lots of different things, which will help you in your decision making. So you can even, for example, use this to see which genres are most watched by which customers, to give them advice. And a database like this, but then more extensive, is exactly what Netflix, for example, uses to give you recommendations about the programs you watch. Yeah, some people created a lot of different tables, but that's not necessarily not correct. So, for example, many people included a table which belonged to which contained the customer information, which is actually a better solution. People created connecting tables with so to include genre, which would yield you another 2 tables, which would make it 6 tables. So 9 tables at all won't be that much in a system like this. Okay. Again, this is this document is available on Canva, so you can look through it if you want in your own time, and feel free to ask any further questions if you have any. On the exam, I have I will ask 2 or 3 multiple choice questions about databases. So I think 2 in the exam, but I don't remember. So it's only a very minor part of the exam, but I do ask a few multiple choice questions about database design in the exam. Okay, and we switch to the part about implementation. Okay, the second topic is implementation. It may be a bit much to do still in the last lecture, but I think that the theory I want to I explain here is I think is pretty interesting, and also pretty practically relevant when you think about how to convince people to use a technology, but also convince people to participate in projects. Because, well, we discussed that, so in your business plan, you worked out on innovation. In the lectures, we discussed a lot of examples of information technologies and information systems that people use in organizations. We discussed what happens when new information systems get introduced in organizations. But the reality is oftentimes so that people resist change. So people don't really want to work with new technologies because they are used to working with, well, because they have their own, because they're just used to working with the things that they are used to work with now. So people are very much resistant to change. So for example, a couple of years ago, we switched from Blackboard to Canvas, and Canvas is arguably better. So everything is better. The layout's better. The usability is way better. But still, there was a lot of resistance, even with me, for switching from Blackboard to Canvas. So simply because we are all used to Blackboard, we knew how it worked, and suddenly a new system is introduced, and then we have to learn a new system, we have to get used to it, and that takes effort, and we don't want to take effort because, well, we have other things to do. And this happens a lot in organizations. So this is one of the main reasons that information technology projects and in general reorganizations fail, because people don't want to change. And implementation strategies are strategies to convince people to adopt a new technology, or in general to adopt a change in the way they work. And there are 4 main categories of implementation strategies that you can use to convince people to use a new communication technology or to work in a different way. And I think these 4 implementation strategies are pretty useful to know. Okay. So first of all, let's discuss a bit of implementation. And well, yeah, like I said, there is a bit of a tension between people in an organization and innovation, and in general new technologies in an organization, because people are used to work in a distinct way in an organization. So they work what they think is quite efficient. You have your day-to-day work that you do every day. That is kind of gee, my English is so bad today, terrible. So you just used to general working in a standard way, in a standard efficient day-to-day way. And that's the way organizations want to function. So they want to be as efficient as possible, and people in organizations want to work and remain working as efficient as far as they themselves consider it to be most efficient as possible. The thing is, when you introduce something new in an organization, so when you introduce creativity, when you introduce innovation, when you introduce new information technologies, that may make sense in the long run for organizations, because it gives you a strategic advantage. So it may yield you more customers or more turnover or profit, etc. But in the short run, it forces people to work in a different way, and they get the impression that they work less efficiently, and that it is often also actually the case when you implement something new in an organization. So there is a tension between the day-to-day operations that people conduct in organizations and innovation and new technology. And you have to handle that as someone who is responsible for implementation and responsible for innovation. So implementation actually touches upon many aspects of an organization. So implementation of technology and innovation is not simply saying, well, we're going to do this in an organization, but you have to take into account the structure, the culture, the people, the innovation itself, the strategy, and the technology. So in order to implement something in an organization. So basically all the aspects that we have covered in the lectures, you need to have a good overview of what these factors are, how they interact in order to be able to implement a new idea into an organization. And this is basically also the most important goal of this course, is to let you think about how different parts of an organization interact. So if you have a new idea for a technology, if you have a new innovation, if something changes in the organization, how does it affect all the other parts of the organization? Okay, so what is an implementation? Well, an implementation is formally that you define an internal strategy in your organization to introduce an innovation or an information system into an organization so that people actually use it. So basically, coming up with an idea of how you can introduce something to the users of a new technology in an organization so that people will actually use it and will not resist it. So the aim of removing resistance and stimulating optimal use. So over the course of the course, we already discussed a bunch of issues with this. So you have to fit an innovation into an organization. So not all innovations and not all technologies are suitable for all organizations. So a very strict enterprise resource planning system is probably not a good technology to introduce in a very professional, organic organization. Similarly, a very broad social media application is probably not suited in an organization with a very strict hierarchy. So you have to fit an innovation to the organization. And to the organization means the structure, the culture, but also the users of the organization. So this relates to the lecture about people and innovation. So you have to convince people that a new technology is useful and it's easy to use. And we discussed the factors that affect perceived usefulness and perceived ease of use in the lecture on individuals and innovation. But in general, so these factors that we discussed there, like output quality, image, subjective norm, perceived ease of use, and the factors affecting it, are all very important. But in general, this means that you have to familiarize users with the technology, and that you have to try to facilitate the use of a new technology of innovation. So the first thing means that you have to train people into using a new technology or new innovation. And the second thing means that you have to actually remove resistance and stimulate use. So basically, implementation of a new technology or innovation in an organization is not so much, it's also, of course, partly a technological process, but it is as much an organizational process as well. So therefore, what you need to do when you want to implement something in an organization is you have to approach it as basically a minor business plan. So you have to formulate a strategy of what you want to accomplish. Okay, we want everyone to use this innovation within half a year. So strategy formulation, project definition. Then you want to formulate concrete strategies or tactics that are aimed at introducing the application to the users, so that you actually remove resistance and stimulate the use of that technology. So like I said, this is oftentimes difficult because people are used to working with in distinct ways. So they are used to working in a specific way, and they really don't want to work in another way. So so when you want to introduce change in an organization, when you want to introduce, for example, a new ERP system, you introduce that in an organization which already has a lot of rules, a lot of procedures, which has people in it that are used to working in a specific way. And you have to take all of that into account. So there are a couple of challenges that make it difficult to implement a new technology in an organization. First of all, the technology is often advanced, so it often requires a new way of working. It is a new technology that requires, it's a new system with a new layout and new procedures, and well, basically everything is new. Where you have to learn where all the buttons are, etc. So it's often at least a bit technologically advanced, which already makes it hard for a bunch of people to use. But secondly, you introduce something in an established firm. So you introduce something in an organization which already has procedures and ways to use technology. has certain business processes, and all these may change because you introduce that new ERP system. And you have to take all that into account. So that's the second one. The third one is that, especially in larger projects, it is oftentimes not very clear where things will end up. So oftentimes there are, especially with those larger innovation projects which take a year, things change throughout the project. You know, people leave their job, maybe a software update is introduced. Oftentimes an organization decides that they need a complete different course of action altogether, and then a project is discontinued, and a new project starts. So it's not always that you make a plan that you can actually conduct the plan as planned. Things change during the course of a project. And especially with larger innovation, you have links with other firms. So, for example, when we look back at the guest lecture at Björn, he works for an organization that helps other organizations with implementing ERP systems. And that already involves 3 different organizations. So it's the organization that Björn works for, where who want to implement a new ERP system. It's the organization Björn itself works for, so his employer, and it's also SAP. So the software vendor. So you already have 3 organizations who are involved in that project, and sometimes it's even more organizations. And finally, and this is also very important, managers tend to think that a technology will automatically solve everything. So usually an organization is not functioning very well, and then managers think, okay, well, what if we introduce a new technology, a technology that is suitable for a specific process, and that will probably solve the issues we now have. But as we have learned, an issue in an organization with technology is almost never a technological issue. So it's almost always an issue with people, or a mismatch between technology and culture and structure, or a misunderstanding of strategy, or whatever. So it's almost never a technological thing. So that also means that technology in itself is almost never the solution to existing issues in your organization, only when you combine it with actually, listening to your people and making other changes as well. But still, many people tend to think if we introduce a new technology, that will solve everything. So those are called magic bullet expectations of technology. And I hope that you have learned enough about this during the past lectures, that you understand that this doesn't work. It doesn't work like that. Okay, well, implementation, very difficult. Okay, what is the solution? How can you make sure that people will actually adopt a new technology or a new innovation in your organization? Well, there are basically 4 different implementation strategies. They're also called models of change. And these are strategies, so these are ways that you can let me see how I can put this best. So these are different ways of formulating your implementation strategy. So you cannot always convince people in the same way. So some people can be convinced with good arguments. Other people you have to force. So look at vaccination, for example. So many people are convinced to take a COVID vaccination because of a good argument, because people say, well, if you get the chances of you being seriously ill are way less when you get vaccinated. So people are convinced by rational arguments. Other people are not convinced by those rational arguments at all. Other people may be more convinced if someone else tells them that, if someone they know tell them, get vaccinated. So the strategy would be not convincing people by rational arguments, but would be convincing people by using people they know, by using people they look up to. Still, other people may not be convinced at all by this, and they actually need to be forced into vaccination, for example, by paying them money or giving them a fine if they refuse vaccination, like they now do in Austria. And those are different tactics for implementing vaccination. And well, I think what we have seen here in the Netherlands is that our implementation strategy to get people vaccinated is more like emergent here. So our tactic is basically changes all the time depending on what is needed, or at least what Young and Margaret thinks is needed to convince people to get vaccinated. So as you see here, these 4 different implementation strategies are not specifically aimed towards technology and innovation, but are general strategies that you can employ to convince people to do your bidding, to do what you want. And they also relate to implementation of IT and innovation, but they can be used to study implementation to convince people of doing something in general. Okay, there are 4 implementation strategies. The first one is life cycle, and life cycle means that you try to convince people with rational goals. So you develop a strategy, you convince people of, okay, this is the usefulness of the technology, and if you use this new technology in this way, then it will help you in your work. So it's really a very rational way of convincing people. The second one is emergent. That is more a implementation strategy where you involve people in the implementation. So it kind of looks like the life cycle, but life cycle is just convincing people by rational arguments, and emergent is more involving people in the implementation itself, so that they feel partly responsible, and so that they develop the strategy and themselves. I have a more elaborate explanation on the next slides. The participative implementation strategies means that you try to convince people of using a technology or doing what you want in general by using social tactics. So, for example, by using influencers or focusing on the commitment of people. So simply by employing social tactics to convince people to do something. And then finally, the political implementation strategy means that you use power. So you use political strategies, like the political is mainly focused on power, to convince people to do something. Okay, let's explain this a bit in more detail. So let's start with life cycle again. Life cycle means that you try to implement information systems or innovation or whatever via thorough project planning with clear objectives and milestones. So it's a bit top down, but it's based on a rational perspective. So this is an implementation strategy that you would use if you think that people in your organization act rationally and can make rational decisions about an organizational change. So your whole philosophy of the implementation is that you think that people are rational beings and can be convinced with rational arguments. So this implementation strategy usually works in organizations when there is it usually works in organizations where people are professional, where people are highly educated, where they understand the implications of a certain organizational change, and when you know they are able to think rationally about that change. So most likely this works in uncontroversial projects and stable environments, together with rational people in your organization. So what you would do concretely when you use this implementation strategy is that you basically you basically tell people what the project is about. So you have thorough project planning, you let people know what the project is, what the end goal is, and why it is useful. So you set realistic, optimistic expectations regarding the value of the application. Basically simply telling people what the advantages are of an innovation or technology or organizational change for them. You educate people, you train people in the use of the new technology, you monitor them, you give feedback in order to help them use a new technology. And of course, you need suitable personnel who can train your people in the organization. So basically, every tactic here is focused on simply explaining people what the technology or the innovation does and how they make best use of it. So this is the life cycle strategy. So a rational project planning and a rational expectation. Rational expectation. The second implementation strategy is quite similar. It also stems from an idea that the people in your organization are rational beings. But here the implementation strategy is more bottom-up. So here you convince people of adopting a new innovation because you actively involve them in the development process. So this is kind of linked to agile development. So the precondition here is that you think people are rational beings in an organization, they are flexible and they are willing to change. This kind of implementation strategy also works in organizations where people are also quite rational, quite highly educated, but also where they are really flexible and are usually willing to work with new technologies because they realize they need it for their work. So often in highly uncertain environments, people know that they need to be innovative in order to keep working efficiently. So if you want to use this implementation strategy in a project or for an organizational change, what you would do here is involve people in the implementation and in the development process. So while in this strategy you develop the technology on your own and then explain to people what will happen, in the emergent strategy, you involve people beforehand. So you involve people in the beginning of the project and explain to them what is going to happen, involve them into the design process. So basically active involvement during the organizational and development trajectory. So you need communication between developers and users. You need active involvement in the design process, so rapid prototyping, agile development. And also of course, you want to educate people and have on-the-job training with the system as well. So this is the emergent strategy. The third one is the participative strategy. And this is quite different from the previous two. So this implementation strategy is based on the idea that people are mostly convinced by others, and that people in an organization mostly are there for social reasons. So they want to satisfy their social needs in the organization. So This would basically mean that you don't try to convince people to use something with arguments, although you probably would also need some kind of rational arguments, but mostly you try to convince people of using a new technology by using social tactics, by simply saying everyone is using it, or saying, well, okay, we need this in an organization because we are in this together. So using social tactics. So this implementation strategy works where users are a bit knowledgeable about the innovation, but they are not that knowledgeable. So they don't really know if the innovation will be actually very useful. They don't have in-depth knowledge of the technology, because if they would have had that, then you could use the life cycle or emergent strategies. But here you think that people in the organization cannot fully be convinced by rational arguments. But if you have an organization in which people can get along, if you have an organization where people are satisfied, where they are committed, where they like each other, then you can use this strategy. So what you would do in this case, so the tactics you would employ, is you would simply promote participation. So you would involve people in the implementation process, not because you want them to actually contribute to it, but just to get them involved. You know, organize drinks, organize walkings, organize Zoom meetings to tell people what's going to happen, etc. Simply getting them socially involved. You can try to influence their attitudes by using basically marketing tactics, you know, by finding influencers, finding opinion leaders, finding people in a network that other people think are important. And if you can convince them, you can convince others. So you simply have to find opinion leaders in your organization. Similarly, as we now look up to influencers on Instagram and buy what they advertised, you can also do that in organizations. You know, find people who are opinion leaders in your organizations and convince them of using a new system, and then they will automatically convince other people. So this relates to subjective norm in the technology acceptance model. So convincing people by using others. So let's do, and of course you also have to give people the opportunity to get acquainted with the system as well. So you have to activate the learning process. So people have to have the idea that they are involved in the implementation, but that they are socially involved. So make it a group learning effort, for example. So in short, this implementation strategy is basically using every social tactic at your disposal to convince people of doing what you want. So finally, maybe the most fun, is the political implementation strategy. And this is convincing people of doing something by using power, or by using authority, or by using a reward or punishment to convince people of changing. So in this strategy is tricky, because if you basically force people to use a new technology, people will become dissatisfied. And then people, you know, they will call in sick, they will refuse work, they will work less efficiently. So you in general don't want to, but sometimes this is the only solution. So for example, when a project needs to be done, when you actually need to change, this may be the only option that you have available. Also in organizations which are very hierarchical, this may also be a good solution, because people are used to politics and authority in the organization. So this strategy basically stems from the idea that people can only be convinced of doing something by political or economic sanctions, both positive and negative. So it doesn't really mean that you have to punish people if they don't use something. You can also reward people if they do use something. So for example, the tactics, so the tactics that you would employ here are, so for example, you know, paying people or refusing to pay people if they do or do not use a certain technology. And that is reorganization of related reward systems. That basically means, paying people or punishing people with less pay if they refuse something. But in general, basically every political strategy you can think of is part of this implementation strategy. So, for example, a tactic may be to have a project leader who has sufficient authority and resources to actually push something through, so to force implementation. So someone with authority who has the power to make decisions. Oftentimes what you see, and this is the last point, is that people hire consultants for this. So they hire an external organization to implement a new system or to do a reorganization of your organization. And organizations hire external consultants not only because those consultants know what they're doing, but also so that they have something to take the blame. So for example, in a reorganization, when you have to lay off a bunch of people in your organization, you can hire an external consultant, and the external consultant will then say, well, yeah, we have to fire a bunch of people. And then you can say, well, yeah, it was not my choice, but it was the external consultant who decided this, and you thought this was the best. So as a manager, you can avoid the blame for reorganizations by hiring external consultants. This may seem weird, but this is actually what happens a lot in organizations. Well, you can use other tactics as well. For example, identifying resistings, co-opting users or group resisting implementation. So simply finding people who resist change in the organizations and forcing them to adopt an innovation, or firing those people, or involving those people in the project planning, so you take away resistance. So all kinds of nasty tactics you can employ to make people do what you want. And that's the political implementation strategy. Okay, finally, finally 2 slides to go. So the choice of, I already said this, of course, when discussing the strategies, the strategy that you choose depends not on what you want, but depends on many factors that are related to the innovation itself, the structure, the culture of the organization, and the people in your organization, etc. So, for example, if you have a very centralized structure, if your organization is fairly hierarchical, then political or life cycle may work best. So if your organization is very decentralized, then life cycle will not work because everyone is basically doing their own thing. So you probably would need a participative or emergent strategy. If you have a very good formal culture, then again, political life cycle may work, etc. If your users are very motivated, then emergent strategy will work. If your users are resisting, then you would probably need political or participative implementation strategies, etc. So in general, the choice of implementation strategy depends on the innovation and all the other characteristics of the organization and the people. So again, technological implementation or implementation of information systems is not a technological implementation, but mostly involves the people and the existing structures and culture and relationships in an organization. I think that's the conclusion of this part, but I think also the central conclusion of the course as a whole. Okay. Are there any questions about this part? Then post them in the chat, and if not, then I suggest we don't have a break, because I think I will need only 10 minutes or so to explain the exam, so we can just continue and quit a bit earlier. Can we use these techniques to convince about an innovation, for example, to convince the early majority about the innovation? Yes, so these are general implementation strategies. So these are actually, so I think they're originally developed also with an idea of implementing technological innovation as an organization, but they can be used as general implementation strategies for innovations in general. So I gave you examples of COVID vaccination, and you can use all the different, well, maybe probably not emergent, but you can use life cycle, participative and political implementation strategies in convincing people to get vaccinated. So you can also apply these innovation strategies to convince people about an innovation, although they are most often used to convince people in organizations or in projects that you have in organizations. But they are widely applicable, and that's why I wanted to explain them, because I think it's quite fun to think about, okay, how do you convince others of your arguments? You know, what kind of tactics do you use? You know, are you political, or do you try to convince people with actual arguments? Are you more participative? So you can also use them in your own discussions. Okay, let's switch to the exam part. Where is that? Here we go. So finally, I want to give you some information about the exam. For school information, yeah, basically, I am convincing you with political strategies. You know, you have to do the exam, so it's mostly a political strategy. Yeah. So, for example, I wanted many of you to be present at the guest lecture. So I actually used a political tactic to force you to attend the guest lecture. So I said beforehand that the guest lecture would be exam literature. So I actually coerced you into attending the guest lecture. So it was a political strategy. Yep, it is also exam material. There are in the exam or the re-exam, there is an open question on implementation strategies. And in the exam or the re-exam, there is a multiple choice, one or two multiple choice questions about implementation strategies. But I forgot which exam contained which question. Yeah. Yeah, it's called machtsmisbruik, absolutely. But sometimes it's a way to convince people of doing your bidding. Okay, exam information. So let me shortly go back to what we learned in the course. So basically, if you look at the learning objectives, so let's start at the bottom. You can advise an organization how to best use IT and social media innovations. That's what you did in the business plan. You can design a basic database. That's what you did in a database assignment. But the rest of the learning goals are tested in the exam. So I want you to explain what innovation is. I want you to be able to explain what an organization is. But most of all, I want you to know the interplay between information technologies, information systems, and organizational processes, etc. So a bunch of the questions in the exam are related to, okay, what is the relationship between a specific IT system and the culture of an organization? So, for example, I may give a case in the exam in which I explain an innovation in an organization, and then I ask questions about the case. For example, I ask you to relate the case to a theory. No, the last two parts are not part of the exam, although, like I said, I will ask a couple of multiple choice questions on database design in the exam. Well, that actually means that the database part is part of the exam, yeah. So especially focus on the interplay between the different parts of an organization. So like I already said, this course was quite packed. So we discussed a bunch of different things. We discussed what an innovation is, the different innovation types. diffusion of innovation, different business models. Those are the things that you will also need to know for the exam. Regarding organizations, we describe the basics of an organizations, and we describe the interplay between IT, innovation, and organization. So the relationship between strategy, culture, structure, people and processes in organizations, and innovation. So you would also need to know, for example, with culture, we learned the 4 cultural types of an organization. You would need to know that. For structure, we have like the 3 dimensions of organization structure, formalization, etc. You would need to know these. You would also need to know the 5 stages of the Rogers adoption model. Yeah, absolutely. You would need to know the technology acceptance model as well. So basically, in every so there are a bunch of major theories about innovation types, diffusion of innovation, structure, culture, technology acceptance model. You would need to know these for the exam. And then finally, we discussed things about IT, so information systems in organizations, hardware, software networks, databases. Those will be mainly asked by means of the multiple choice questions. So of course, there may be an open question, explain this information system, but I will ask, I think, 2, maybe 3 multiple choice questions about technology. So I may ask a multiple choice question about what a network is, or what the TCP/IP protocol is. So based on the technology lecture. Okay. But like I explained, the main conclusion is interaction. So the main takeaway of this course is that innovation and technology doesn't happen in a vacuum, but several forces are at play in the innovation process. So innovation depends on people, organizations, etc. Similarly, IT and innovation in organizations also depends on the whole interaction and interplay between different parts of the organization. And that's what some of the open questions will also be about. To relate innovation to people, to relate innovation to structure, to relate strategy to culture, etc. Okay, so what can you expect on the exam? Well, the duration of the exam is 2.5 hours. It's a closed book exam, and the exam is offline. The exam is in English. The questions and the answers should be in English as well. You cannot take a dictionary with you during the exam. You don't need a dictionary because most of the difficult words in the exam are words that are related to theories that you will have to understand anyways. So, for example, technology acceptance model is something that you can look up in a dictionary, but it will bring you nowhere because you simply have to know what a technology acceptance model is. I have made sure that in the exam I use no very difficult English words, and if I do so, I usually have a simpler explanation in the exam as well. So don't worry about that. No, I don't think I said that you aren't allowed to answer in Dutch. So we also have a lot of international students, and the international students also cannot answer in their own language. So I do not see why Dutch students should be able to answer in Dutch, while, for example, an Italian student is forced to answer in English and not in Italian. So you have to answer in English. If you're Dutch and if you cannot come up with a word, just say it in the just explain it. It does say so in the course information. Seriously? Oh, that's completely incorrect. Answer in English. And if you cannot come up with a word, or if you cannot come up with a sentence, do it in Dutch. It's probably better to answer in English anyway, because else you spend like 20 minutes on trying to translate things. So It's okay if you put a couple of words in Dutch if you cannot come up with a word, but it's probably easier to start answering in English because everything is in English in this course. I missed a bunch of questions. Practice exam. No, there will not be a practice exam. Why? First of all, creating a very good exam costs me about like 3 days or so. And what usually happens is that we create a very lousy practice exam because we don't have time, and then the practice exam is not a good reflection of the actual exam. Moreover, I never give practice exams in my courses, and my courses do just as well in terms of people who pass it as courses with a practice exam. So I think last year about 90% of people, maybe even a bit, no, yeah, 90% of people passed the course in the first or second try, also without a practice exam. That's important as well. So although we had a lot of, we discussed a lot of things in the course, the overall success rate of the exam is quite high. So I think last year it was 80%. So I think about 70 to 80% passes for the exam, and then for the re-exam about 70 to 80% passes for the re-exam. So if you study, then you shouldn't think that much about the exam. Course manual, you have to receive a 6 in order, so not a 5.5 as always. Yeah, the course manual also states that we have to round grades to the nearest half, with the exception of 5.5. So similar to the business plan, when you have a 5.5 for the exam, it's rounded to a 6.0. When you have a 5.4 for the exam, it's rounded down to a 5. And for everything else, it's rounded to the nearest half. So 6.3 will be a 6.5, and a 6.2 will be a 6.0. So it's only with 5.5 is rounded to a 6. What I always do is the students who have between a 5 and 5.4, I always regrade these to see if I can add a couple of points, because it's so lullig, cannot come up with the Dutch word, with the English word as well, if you have a 5.4 and fail the exam. Where are more questions clear? How much MC and how much open questions? Here we go. Tips for studying? Yeah, I do. What if you could not attend the guest lecture? Let me first do that one. I have no questions about the guest lecture in the exam. I have a multiple choice question in the exam in which I say, for example, in the guest lecture, but you are able to answer that question if you have not attended the guest lecture. So no worries about the guest lecture. Yeah, thanks. It was not recorded as well. Okay, tips for studying in a minute. So first, the exam covers all the lectures and corresponding literature, but well, that's the first tip for the for studying, is that I base my exam on the lecture slides. So if you go through the lecture slides, if you understand everything that's on the lecture slides, if you can apply the lecture slides, then you understand, then you can do the exam well. What I would do is go through the lecture slides, see if you understand everything, and then browse to the literature as an additional information. I explained things in the lectures, but if you do to the literature, they explain it in a different way, which is probably sometimes better. But basically, you then have like 2 ways that the material is explained, and it will help you remember it better. But the lecture slides are leading in the exam. It also means that I will not ask questions in the exam about stuff that is in the literature that was not in the lecture. So I only ask questions about things that I actually discussed in the lectures. Okay, there are 2 parts in the exam. There's a multiple choice part, which is 25 multiple choice questions. There is no chance correction or whatever. So it's simply that every correct multiple choice questions gives you 2 credits for a total of 50 credits. Then we have 4 open questions. All those open questions consist of multiple sub questions, so 1, A, B, etc. I don't know, I think there's one question that only is one question, question 2. And they will give you another total of 50 credits if you answer them all correctly, which is a total of 100 credits, and your grade is the credits you have divided by 10. So make sure you keep track of time. So do not spend 1.5 hours on the multiple choice questions. Yeah, there's no guessing correction. Yeah, 25 multiple choice questions is 50 credits, so 2 points per correct multiple choice questions. Yeah, well, yeah, well, thanks, but also, so you get a total of 100 credits. So if you have everything incorrect, you have a 0 instead of a 1. And normally we start with a 1 for the exam, but I start at 0. So that's a bit of the, you know, that's a bit of the change correction you have, but it's not, well, yeah. 100 credits, your exam grade is credits divided by 10. Cannot be easier. A couple of examples questions later on. So the exam is 15th at 12 o'clock. The re-exam is already January 12th. So the 16th, the 17th, and over the weekend, I'll be grading exams. But I hope to have your exam grades on Canvas. Probably be the Monday, the 20th, yes. I will do the exam review on the 22nd of December, but I still have to think of how I organize the exam review. I think it will be offline as well, but I have to think about how we can do it safely, you know, corona-wise. So more information about that, but you know, expected grades around on December 20, and the re-exam will be on the exam review will be on December 22nd. So that if you do not have, so that if you do not pass the exam, you have plenty of time to study for the re-exam. So I realize that it's not nice that you, if if you fail the exam, that you know that you have failed just before Christmas, but you know, it gives you a lot of time to prepare for the re-exam if needed. Okay, exam questions. There are 3 types of questions, so these are also some general tips. So in general, when we lecturers, teachers prepare exams, we think about 3 main types of questions. So first of all, we have knowledge questions. So we simply ask you to reproduce something you have learned. So what is the second stage of the second adoption stage in Rogers diffusions of innovations model? So the second adoption stage is the early adopters. So that's a knowledge question. You simply have to know that. Name the 4 culture types, those kind of things. So those are basically knowledge questions. So there are a couple of those in multiple choice questions, and maybe some open questions. Mostly we ask, yeah, I'll come to that later. The second type of questions is insight questions, in which you have to not just simply reproduce, but in which you have to explain something. So for example, I can ask, explain what an ERP system is, explain the difference between information technology and an information system, explain how to convince people in the later stages of the adoption process, how to adopt an innovation. So explain the things that you learned. So it's knowing something, but it's also the ability to explain things. So what I always do in an exam, so if you took communications theory from me in the bachelor, you already know this. I always underline and make bold important words. So I always, if you have to explain something in the question, the explain part is made bold and underlined. So you know that you don't have to simply say yes, but explain something. So that's insight questions. And we can also, finally, we have application and analysis questions. And those are the most difficult types of questions. in which you actually have to do something with what you know. So for example, I can give an example of an IT system. So I say, okay, you have a customer relationship management system with these characteristics. Explain to me if this, in what type of organizational structure this system would fit best. And then you have to know something about the different organization structures. You have to know what a CRM system is, and you have to tie these two together in order to answer the question. Another example, I could say, smartwatches, they are quite new. Explain to me in what stage of the adoption process smartwatches are now. And then you have to think of, okay, smartwatches, who has smartwatches, who hasn't. What are the stages in what's the use of innovation model? Okay, maybe it's early majority. And then explain why you think it's early majority. And then if you have it incorrect, but you still have a good explanation, you still get most of the points for the question. And those are analysis and application questions. And especially in the open questions, I ask a lot of these, but also in the multiple choice questions, I can ask questions like these. Another exam tip is then that if you have a question like that, answer the question like I am a moron. Well, that is probably not difficult to imagine, but it basically means don't assume I know everything, anything. So, for example, if I ask, let's give the previous example is actually a good example question. Explain in which innovation stage you think a smartwatch is. First explain what you think a smartwatch is and how many people have adopted it. Then explain what stage, then explain what the stage is that you think it is in. So do not simply say it is in the early majority, but say the early majority means blah, 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 and then say smartwatch is in the early majority because. Because if you don't do that, I cannot tell if you know what the early majority is or if you just have made something up. So explain it to me like I don't know the course materials. And I think that's a very important general tip in making exams. So don't assume that we know what it is about. So, this is already insight, I think, for a bit. So this is an example of a multiple choice question. So if we ask things like mention, define, describe, as an example of an open question is, we discussed the difference between data and information, describe the difference between data and information. I will answer your questions in a moment. So insight means, for example, here, so we explain the difference between an architectural and a revolutionary innovation and give an original example of both types of innovation. So this means you don't have to simply know what it is about, but you have to explain it and give an example. So this is really an insight question. So it's not enough to simply learn by heart the difference between architectural and revolutionary, but you also have to understand what it means. So finally, this is an example of an application and analysis case. So example here is Alex has a side hustle and gives training in time management. However, recently a new technology has been introduced that automatically teaches people to manage their time. As a result of the popularity of this system, Alex had to train himself in the use of the software and now gives advice on how to best use the software. So the question then would be, would this change in strategy be best described as a business alignment or a business impact strategy? And explain your answer. Do you know the answer to this question? Yes. Yeah, it would be business impact. Because business impact means that something happens in the environment of an organization which forces you to change your strategy, and this is what happens. So it was not my idea to train myself in using the software, but it's a new technology that I observe in the market, and that forces me to refocus my strategy. So it's business impact. So that's a correct answer, but simply saying business impact in this case would not be enough. So you have to explain why. So B, what would be the main cost streams for Alex, and what would be the main revenue streams for Alex? Explain your answer. And then we'll be thinking about, okay, how would Alex make money? What would cost him money? So for example, I probably would be paid by people who take my training. Probably I would need training in a new software myself, and I would need to subscribe to the new software. So those would be cost streams, etc. Yeah, subscribe to Alex on my OnlyFans account. Yeah, well, here I ask for revenue stream, so that would be the same as a revenue model. Exactly, yes. So, so in the exam, I would ask, so for example, for this innovation, what would be a logical revenue model? And then you would have to come up with revenue models for that specific innovation. So for example, if I say Google Glass, explain to me what a revenue model is, then you would have to think of, okay, how can we make money with Google Glass? Can we directly sell it? Can we use it as a middleman approach? Can we have, I forgot all those revenue models. So can we, for example, have paid advertisements in Google Glass? So that would be different revenue models. Yeah. Exams are never fun, but these mini cases in which you have a kind of a description of an organization and then have a bunch of questions is, as far as exams go, they are not too bad in answering. So they are not extremely boring. So let me browse through the questions. There was a question which was already answered about grayed out slides. Yeah, those are hidden. You don't have to know them. So every slide that is hidden and grayed out is not exam literature. Will we have a paper which you can write the answer to the MC question, take a witness so you can check them when they get published? No, because what happens when I publish my multiple choice questions, I will see them on Stufia next year, and I don't want that. So you can review the multiple choice questions during the exam. Fortunately, you will have your grades within 3 days of making the exam, so you don't have to wait too long to know your grade. Any other questions about the exam? Okay, if you have additional questions about the literature, want me to explain anything, you can email me, but you also can post it on Canva, so I can reply to it on Canva, so other students can read the answer as well. I would really appreciate it if you would ask me the question not a day or an hour before the exam, because then I may not have time to answer you. So if you have any questions, feel free to ask them, but make sure you are in time for me to have time to answer them before the exam. Okay, if there are no further questions, then I suggest we say goodbye. And I want to thank you very much for your attention. Thank you very much for the interesting business plans, and I very much hope to see you in real life in another course. So thank you very much. I hope you enjoyed it at least somewhat, and or have learned something from the course. So thank you very much. And, good luck with the exam and all your other exams.